While he enjoyed the summer weather, there was always one thing at the back of John's mind. That was his choir, his beloved choir that had become so much of a part of his life. Normally, the new season started after the summer holidays when the children were back at school and their parents were back at work. It all started in the third week of September. They had their first meetings one evening in the middle of the week. It was always in a small hall in the centre of Brussels. There were usually about 100 people who had attended. These were mainly women, but there were also a reasonable number of expat men who were also there to sing. There was always a problem of balancing the difference between the men and the women, but John had an old friend who he added as his musical director. Also, they had a woman who was a professional music teacher who every year took on the task of teaching these volunteers how to sing in key. There were no auditions, so she had a job trying to get some of the new members singing in key. It was a social occasion every week, which many people enjoyed, and through the efforts of John and his friends, they'd built up a good reputation in the city. The climax of the year was the Christmas concert, held in the week just before the seasonal holidays began. Each year, John had found different venues. Some were churches, some were small theatres, and others were just a space large enough to see the people who wanted to attend. For John, the Christmas concert was the pinnacle of his year, and to a certain extent his life. It was the event that made his name around Brussels. Everyone knew John because of his end-of-year concerts. Invitations were sent out to many influential people, politicians, ambassadors, and other celebrities. Most accepted the invitations, and often these concerts would be a star-studded occasion. Before those concerts, there was also a lot of hard work training the choir, making sure that the rehearsals were well attended every week. John was in charge and made sure that everyone was suitably informed by email. Although he himself didn't sing, in fact, everyone agreed that really he had a terrible singing voice. But his enthusiasm was infectious. He could be demanding and sometimes annoying, but everyone respected him for the work he had put into the group over the years. He was tireless. Kurt, however, was also there, but always in the back helping, and this is the way he liked it. The idea of standing on a stage singing was something he couldn't possibly realize. He was happy supporting John, though, and making sure that everything went smoothly. As Max was now part of the family, he was expected to participate and help Kurt with the arrangements. For Max, he had never considered joining the choir and singing, so helping Kurt was an ideal situation for him. Every week they would turn up at the meeting room. John and Kurt were more relaxed now about leaving the house empty. It wasn't empty, though. Wotan was a fully grown black Great Dane. He would frighten any burglar, although in reality he was a softy and would probably run in the opposite direction. However, the sight of him barking at someone breaking into the house would be enough to frighten anyone, and as such, Kurt was happy that the house was suitably protected now. Before the other members of the group arrived, there were tables and chairs to be moved to make space at one side of the room. During the day, the room was used as a classroom, so the place was filled with tables and chairs. These were carefully moved to the side to give the choir a meeting room. There was also a makeshift bar set up with beers, soft drinks, and coffee. This was so that the choir could have a half-time break and enjoy a drink. It was a popular part of the meeting, although John always insisted that people should offer payment. They were not openly charged for the break, but they were expected to pay. The actual rehearsals were held in another, larger room where there was a piano. John, together with his music teacher and music director, always chose the songs that were going to be learned and sung that year at the concert. There was always some discussion about the choices, but it was always John who won in the end. Everyone also respected his choice of music, as he had an in-depth knowledge of classical music. He also had an ability to find lesser-known pieces that he thought would be of interest, and he had found through his numerous books and contacts in the opera world. The choice was always traditional, though. Traditional songs. Sometimes there were carols, but there were also a number of lesser known pieces that made the evening special. For the final performance, John would often invite a local soprano to join them to sing occasional solos with the choir. As the rehearsals progressed week after week, Max was beginning to become impressed by their dedication, but also their ability to come together as a real choir. None of them were professional singers, however, hard work had turned them into a real, professional sounding choir. Max was not an expert in music, but to his ear, they did sound good. He would be quite happy spending an evening listening to them. Where they were going to be performing their Christmas concert was always something for discussion. John spent time visiting different venues around the centre of Brussels. He often liked to find a new place to present his choir rather than going to the same place year after year. He did, though, have one place that he wanted to perform, a place he knew well, but he had always thought as an amateur choir they would never get the chance. That place was the Royal Opera House of Brussels, La Monnaie de Munt. He dreamed of performing there, but had always dismissed the thought. This year, though, he had gathered his courage and asked the director of the Opera House if he could bring his choir to such a prestigious event. To his surprise, the director had agreed, and John was ecstatic. It turned out that in the weeks before the Christmas break, the Opera House was presenting Don Giovanni by Mozart. It so happened that there was no performance of the opera on a Sunday. The Opera House would be dark that day, so the director gave John permission to bring his choir to the house for that one day. The only requirement was that the stage set shouldn't be moved, as there would be performances on the following Monday, and he didn't want his expensive stage set either changed, moved, or damaged. The other restriction was that all the work had to be done by the choir members. His staff would not be working that day, and he wasn't prepared to pay them extra money to work on a Sunday. John had agreed to all this. So it was on one of the rehearsal evenings at the end of November that John made a special announcement to the choir. They were going to perform a Christmas concert this year, as usual. This time, though, they would be performing on the stage of the Royal Opera House. There were gasps, short intakes of breath. This amateur choir would be performing on the stage of a prestigious opera house, as if they were real professional singers. If they were to put on such a performance, then their singing would have to be perfect. They could not let themselves down in front of an audience that would be sitting in the seats and boxes of the auditorium. Even though the audience would mainly be made up of friends and families, there would also be special invited guests. This was serious. It had to be right. It had to show them at their best. It had to be an evening to remember. The morning after his announcement, John was excited, but he was also worried. It was not exactly a panic attack, but when Max had joined him in the kitchen, he could see him agitated. The reality of what he had announced had come home. "I've got to organize this," he said with a sound of disbelief. "I've got to organize a choir and put a performance on at the Royal Opera House," he said, looking directly at Max. It was early in the morning, and although Max was pouring himself a coffee, John had already taken a can of beer out of the fridge and was drinking it. Okay, I'll help you, said Max, trying to calm him down. It can't be that difficult. A look of panic crossed John's face and he emptied his can of beer in one go. In the following days, John talked with the other members of the choir and various other people in Brussels who could help him. First of all, there was the tickets that people were all already asking about. How much would they cost? How much should he charge? First of all, he found a plan of the seating in the auditorium. He could recognize the ticketing based on where people would be sitting. The stalls would be the cheapest, and then people would have to pay more in the upper galleries than the boxes. How much was he going to charge? It was going to be difficult. The price couldn't be anywhere near the price opera goers usually pay to be in the audience of a professional performance. After all, these were friends and families of the choir members who would make up the most of the audience. Finally, though, he decided on a price, and everyone agreed that it was a reasonable price for everyone, and it would appeal to families who would be bringing children with them. Then there was the question of arranging the choir on the stage. It was a lot larger than they were normally used to, and John didn't know how he would arrange the choir on it. There would be about 100 singers in the main group. Then, normally, they would have a smaller children's choir which came from one of the local schools. Then there was going to be the choice of a guest soloist soprano, who he had not yet thought of. There was so much to do, so much to organize, and they only had a couple of weeks to get it all together. Local businesses were helpful with gifts and donations. One contact was a garden centre who were prepared to give John any leftover Christmas trees that they couldn't sell before Christmas. Although they didn't know at the time how many they could give him, they would be useful to dress the stage and provide a Christmas feel to the evening. The problem for John was that the stage would be full of the sets for the Don Giovanni performance, and he had been given strict instructions that he should not touch any of them. So the question was, how could he place a full choir on the stage while they were surrounded by all these expensive stage sets? For John, there was only one answer. He would have to see the stage before the day and decide how all this was going to work. As the day approached, the rehearsals for the choir were becoming more detailed and more intensive. Everyone was determined that this would be a performance of their best work. Some of the members were not sure that it was a good idea appearing in an opera house and were nervous about appearing on stage. They were only amateurs, and if it didn't go well, then they would be all embarrassed. This only placed more pressure on John, and for the first time he was beginning to question if this was such a good idea. Previous performances had been in quiet, smaller venues, and no one really expected any great things from the choir. It was usually just a relaxed, pleasant evening out for their families in the week before the Christmas holidays. This performance, though, was going to be difficult. As far as anyone in Brussels could remember, this was the first time that an amateur choir had ever appeared on the stage of the Royal Opera House. Expectations were high, and it wasn't helping that some very important people in the city of Brussels were asking for tickets to this special evening. They would be there as his guests, and John was now thinking about how they could view him, and if it all went horribly wrong. For John, his reputation was on the line. There could be no mistakes. It all had to be perfect.